Hello. Yeah, just testing. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great, yeah, that's better. Thank you.
Hi, Raquel and Lea, could you help me renaming your users? Or I think both of you are gonna do English Spanish, right?
Yes, that's right. Let me do that. Just a sec.
Thank you. Mina, are you still here with us? Because I think it's only you that who can add them. Hi, Sumina, could you hear me?
Yes, Abiria, did you say to include everybody in the waiting room?
No, if you can put Lea and Raquel into the Spanish booth, please.
Oh, the interpretation, you mean? Yeah. Okay.
Good day, everyone. We are just finalizing some of the logistical part, and we will begin with the event. Just grant us a couple more minutes, and we will start. If I can just get a confirmation from the 4 interpreters that you are on the right booth, we could begin the event. Just give me some thumbs up, or in the chat you can tell me. Okay, perfect. Hello, everyone. Good day to you all, wherever you are. It's a pleasure to have you here with us. My name is Amelia Regin, coordinator of the UNCBD Women Caucus, and I will be your moderator today. It is a pleasure to welcome you all to this virtual roundtable on how to gender responsibly mobilize resources for biodiversity conservation. This session is co-hosted by the CBD Women's Caucus, the platform for women around the world to participate directly into the CBD negotiations, and also in collaboration with the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity. But just before starting, I would like to highlight some logistical elements. So please notice that we have interpretation support into Spanish and French. If you would prefer to listen to the webinar in any of these languages, please use the setup. Let me try to share the screen again. Yes, so please make use of the interpretation feature that is on the bottom of your screen. If possible, please leave your cameras on and your mics off. Speak slowly. This is mostly for my dear panelists, and for everyone, please leave your comments and questions in the chat box. And after our panel has delivered their message, we will have a long Q&A segment, question and answer segment. for everyone to share their comments and questions. And please join me in welcoming our panel that will be with us today. And we have five really dear esteemed panelists. First, we have Markus Lehmann from the CBD Secretariat. We have Ching from Third World Network. We also have with us Minnie Degawan from the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity. Valentina Figuera representing the Global Forest Coalition, and Verona Collantes from the JEF Secretariat. It is a real pleasure to have you with us here today, this morning. And but just before giving the microphone to Markus, if you allow me to give just a bit of introduction to what we are expecting to discuss today. And it is a really, when COP15 happened, we were really happy because we achieved many historical decisions. That is the adoption of decision on resource mobilization. That is a significant step forward in advancing the implementation of the Kunming-Montreal framework and the CBD work programs in general. This decision outlines a resource mobilization strategy covering a mandate immediate phase from 2023 and 2024 and a medium-term phase from 25 to 2030 to support the achievement of the ambitious biodiversity targets set out in the framework. This decision in particular underlines the importance of mobilizing resources to drive transformative change with a focus on ensuring biodiversity conservation, climate change mitigation, and sustainable development. But central to this decision is the recognition of the need to align financial mechanisms, institutions, and initiatives with the objectives of the Kunming Global Biodiversity Framework. But in order to achieve these comprehensive and sustained results, for us as Women Caucus, we consider it is imperative that resource mobilization should be seen through a gender-responsive and human rights-based lens. The inclusion and empowerment of women and girls are essential components of effective resource mobilization, ensuring equitable access, participation, and benefits for all. By examining the intersections between gender, human rights, and mobilization, resource mobilization, with this event, to identify endpoints, strategies, and best practices on how to effectively mobilize resources with a gender perspective. And having said that, just a quick reminder to my fellow panelists that each of you will have up to 10 minutes to deliver information. And as interview, we will go then to the questions or comments addressed in the chat. And now, let us hear from Markus Lehmann, head of the Economic Policy Unit at the Secretariat of the CBD, who will give us an overview of the key objectives and components of Decision 15.7 on resource mobilization. And he will also tell us where it is standing right now in terms of implementation. Thanks so much, Markus, for being with us today.
Thank you, Amelia, for the introduction and for the kind words. And welcome to all of you. Good time of the day to all of you. Yeah, it will be my pleasure to give some brief opening remarks, setting the scenes a bit with regard to COP15 outcomes. I mean, with regard to gender responsiveness, one of the major outcomes is, of course, the gender plan of action. But I mean, that is a standalone piece and standalone COP decision. But of course, we must recall ourselves that actually the main, let's say, thrust of the gender plan is to achieve gender mainstreaming across all the different topics of the convention. So here we are on resource mobilization. That's, of course, a particularly important topic. So it's basically compounded by the thrust of the gender plan of action. I just wanted to mention that because we talk a lot about biodiversity mainstreaming, but gender mainstreaming, in fact, is key also. Now, Amelia already made reference to the framework that we adopted at COP15, And I don't really have to recall much here, but bear in mind, I mean, we have target 19 now adopted. And in terms of gender responsiveness, of course, all the sub-targets contained therein are important and need to be looked at from that perspective. But I also wanted to highlight that one of the sub-targets is on collective action and non-financial contributions of local communities, including women. So a gender perspective or gender responsiveness is also very important here. And then also as a reminder that in the strategic plan, we have these, let's say, cross-cutting or horizontal considerations in the chapeau sections of the framework before the goals and targets. And one of them is, of course, to adopt a human rights-based approach where that particular perspective comes in again. In terms of the further work, Amelia mentioned the strategy for resource mobilization, the first phase that was adopted by COP15. But of course, that is slated for further work, for further refinement, and for aligning the strategy with the other COP decisions and the framework itself. So that's upcoming work to be undertaken by this newly established advisory committee on resource mobilization, which will meet in person for the first time next week, actually, in Kinshasa, Democratic Republic of the Congo. And the committee is balanced with representatives or members from parties, party nominated, but also 20 representatives, members from international organizations and stakeholders, including women. So very pleased to note that Amelia is part of that group. And that is, of course, provides a key entry point in the months to come to bring ideas on how to strengthen the gender perspective in the strategy. There is already elements there. I mentioned the role of collective action, human rights-based approaches, but this is work in progress, and the task of the committee is to further strengthen the strategy. So that would certainly provide an important entry point. I will not preempt the discussions that are slated to take place in the coming months. So with that, perhaps thanks again for having me, and I pass over to my fellow speakers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Markus. And we all are really waiting and looking forward to collaborate. So between all of us, we strengthen that strategy and put it in place. And actually, with this foundation lay that you have set up, let's now hear from Ching from the Third World Network, because she has a really clear message on what should we be thinking about when it comes in the link in between Decision 15.7 and the social and environmental justice. So please, Ching, if you can share with us your insights regarding this.
Thank you so much, Amelia. Good time of day to everyone. I think following on from what Markus has explained, obviously the Decision 15.7 is closely linked to the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, or GBF. We know that without the mobilization of financial resources, there's actually a danger that the targets of the GBF will not be met. As Markus has mentioned, Goal D and Target 19 specifically address financial resources, but we can't see this in isolation from the rest of the GBF, nor from the provisions of the convention. I just have a few observations on how I think social and environmental justice interface with resource mobilization and the GBF. The first point to make is that the CBD, as a real convention, incorporates the principles of equity and common but differentiated responsibilities, or CBDR. CBDR means that developed countries bear the greater responsibility to address biodiversity loss because A, they have contributed more to global environmental degradation, both historically and today, and B, they have more command of appropriate technologies and financial resources. Now, most of the world's remaining biodiversity is in developing countries, and the burden for action actually lies heavily on them and on their peoples, in particular women and indigenous peoples and local communities, or IPLCs. Now, in Montreal last year at COP15, more than 70 developing countries asked that developed countries meet their legally binding obligations to provide financial resources to them. Now, this is in Article 20, paragraph 4 of the Convention. The developing countries asked for at least $100 billion annually. Now, we know that the estimated amount needed for biodiversity conservation is between $700 to $900 billion annually. But when we look at the details of Target 19, the aim is to increase resources from developed to developing countries to at least $20 billion per year by 2025 and to at least $30 billion per year by 2030. Now, this is only a small proportion, about 10 to 15% of the overall pledge to mobilize $200 billion per year. We think that, sadly, this is actually inequitable, not just for developing countries, but also for their peoples. After all, women and IPLCs have actually done the least to cause the biodiversity crisis, yet they suffer the most from extractive industries that decimate biodiversity and violate human rights. And at the same time, women and IPLCs are the best stewards of biodiversity. So if financial resources are not fairly provided, how will they be enabled to continue protecting biodiversity? So there has to be justice in the fair sharing of the means of implementation. Secondly, the human rights-based and gender-just approaches embedded in the GBF, including in its Section C, have to inform the resource mobilization strategy and GBF implementation. Specifically, targets 22 and 23, which focus on participation, justice and rights for IPLCs, women, youth, persons with disabilities and environmental defenders, and gender equality and gender responsiveness, must not be viewed in isolation, but actually integral to the GBF. And this includes how resources are mobilized. Now, in this regard, the high reliance in the resource mobilization strategy and Target 19 on private, blended, and innovative finance or market-based approaches to provide financial resources does need to be questioned. Will these approaches ensure environmental and social justice, or will they exacerbate injustices? For one, there appears to be a lot of faith in private finance, but evidence shows that so far, relatively small amounts of private investments have been generated for biodiversity. And worse, these can have negative social impacts and entrench social and gender inequalities. For example, blended finance or using public funds to leverage private investments means that investors receive public guarantees from the state to ensure they get a return. But it does not necessarily guarantee environmentally beneficial and socially just outcomes. This will result in private gains, but social losses, including for women and girls. Furthermore, market-based mechanisms such as carbon and biodiversity offsets essentially commodify and financialize biodiversity and its functions. They have potential and disproportionate impacts on women and girls, particularly if such schemes result in dispossession or land grabs. Third, social and environmental justice, resource mobilization, and GBF implementation are actually best realized when IPLCs, women, youth, and other rights holders receive sufficient funding so that they can continue conserving and sustainably using biodiversity. Ongoing efforts to improve the proportion of, for example, GEF funds available directly accessible to IPLCs should be supported. But there are also other less obvious pathways that could generate substantial financial resources for biodiversity in a manner that takes social and environmental justice into account, namely tax reform and debt justice. We know that current economic structural conditions create pressures that drive extractivism and biodiversity loss while undermining and reducing public spending that is available for biodiversity. For example, tax havens cost governments between $500 to $600 billion a year in lost taxation, including a loss to non-OECD economies of $200 billion. And developing countries' debt is around $11 trillion, with debt service payments estimated at $3.4 trillion annually. Now imagine if these amounts were available for biodiversity action. Ending tax avoidance and illicit financial flows while providing debt relief and addressing debt restructuring fairly would provide fiscal space for developing countries to reach biodiversity targets. Importantly, the debt austerity nexus is also gendered, with women and girls affected disproportionately. So debt and tax justice could actually start to right the historic imbalance between those who have economically benefited the most from biodiversity decline and those who have not. I wanted to share a couple more insights on how the resource mobilization strategy can be tailored to address specific needs and priorities of women and girls while ensuring the active participation in biodiversity conservation. Well, I think as Markus has already alluded to, firstly, the strategy on resource mobilization can pick up on target 19, paragraph F, which focuses on collective action, including by Indigenous peoples and local communities, Mother Earth-centric actions, and non-market approaches, including community-based natural resource management and civil society cooperation and solidarity aimed at the conservation of biodiversity. These actions by IPLCs, women, and other rights holders hold tremendous value. These actors make important investments and contributions, both monetary and non-monetary, to biodiversity. One recent study estimated that IPLCs invest through cash and labor an estimated 15 to 23% of the amount spent on conservation by governments, donors, foundations, and NGOs combined. Now, this is equivalent to 3.16 to 4.57 billion US dollars. So Indigenous peoples are contributing both in monetary and non-monetary terms to biodiversity, and we know this, and this is borne out by the evidence. So biodiversity finance should be channeled to further support these approaches and those who are stewarding biodiversity well, particularly women. Equally important would be to address the obstacles and challenges that prevent the scaling up of such actions and approaches. In particular, the improved recognition of land tenure and women's access and rights to land, as recognized in targets 22 and 23 of the GBF, are really critical elements that have both biodiversity and social and environmental justice benefits. There are many other collective actions and non-market activities, including community conservation areas such as territories of life, as well as forest restoration efforts that should also be supported. And secondly, the strategy on resource mobilization can move away from a reliance on private blended and innovative finance or market-based approaches. This will help avoid the potential harms that these approaches could have on women and girls. And at the very least, as envisaged by Target 19D, environmental and social safeguards need to be multilaterally agreed and their compliance ensured. And these safeguards must, as a prerequisite, respect, fulfill, protect, and guarantee the rights of IPLCs, peasants, and other people working in rural areas, women and youth, in accordance with relevant international human rights laws and norms. So in summary, we really need a two-pronged approach in the resource mobilization strategy that can address the specific needs and priorities of women and girls. One, stop using financial instruments that perpetuate negative impacts on women and girls' rights and livelihoods. And two, scale up efforts that are rooted in women's and girls' rights-based and gender-responsive actions, including allowing for their meaningful participation, as envisaged in Target 22. With this, I'll stop here and be happy to accept questions later in the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ching. I think that you have actually set up really, really important points. And I will just bring up one to link into our next panelist, but because in the Q&A segment, we will have a bit more time to follow up on your points. And one is, as you said, the gender perspective into resource mobilization. One of the main demands is that the overall decisions do not increase the burden or do not increase inequalities. No? And with that idea, we can go now into listen now from Valentina Figuera, representing the Global Forest Coalition. And Valentina, we would like to hear your thoughts on the key challenges women face in accessing and benefiting from biodiversity finance mechanisms. And if you could highlight some specific success stories where the inclusion of women in resource mobilization initiatives has led to improved outcomes, both for biodiversity and for women and girls, please.
Yes, thank you, Amelia, and also thank you to all the participants for being here. I want to present briefly some reflections in dialogue with what just Ching shared. Could you please let me know if you can see my screen?
Yes, we are looking at the presentation.
Yes, thank you. So I would like to start. My presentation is entitled Barriers and Opportunities for Women's Participation in Resource Mobilization. I would like to start with the fundamentals, but my colleagues Markus and Ching already discussed about this. So I'm not gonna stop too much into this, but it is just a reminder for those who may not be that involved into so technical issues. Fundamentals is Article 20 on financial resources, which, you know, designs the framework on how the architecture will work. Also, the social sphere is included in terms of highlighting the need to have the social development and the economic development, including the eradication of poverty, as a first and overriding priority. Also, in the framework of the Kunming-Montreal GBF, Goal D, related to adequate means for resource mobilization, including capacity building, technical and scientific cooperation. And as it was mentioned by Ching and Markus, targets 14, 15, 18, and 19, which we already discussed in a previous session hosted by the Women's Caucus, are also fundamental to understand where we are at in terms of the framework and the convention. And then, of course, decision 15.7 on resource mobilization, which includes initiatives like the committee, who also Ching and Amelia are part of, is fundamental. So some critical perspectives regarding the issue is the fact that forests and biodiversity are not a commodity. It is problematic to make biodiversity conservation an investable asset. We can just, cannot just reduce a complex forest ecosystem into one convenient value, the amount of carbon in trees. It is fundamental to understand that and consider the cultural, spiritual, and traditional role of forests, ecosystems for indigenous peoples and local communities, and especially in women. This is why we have to focus our efforts on a longer-term transformative path, which includes reducing emissions and a degrowth approach. So instead of funneling financial resources to private markets, we should develop coordinated actions to allocate funds to IPLCs and women-led initiatives, of course, while at the same time concentrating efforts on addressing the economic drivers of forest loss. Also, I think it is fundamental to highlight the fact that national biodiversity strategies and action plans must include direct support to IPLCs, especially women in all the diversities, with priorities identified by communities. And eliminating perverse incentives under target 18 and 19, it's also fundamental to continue these discussions and these reflections. A transformative path, and I would like to share this diagram on this pyramid that you can see in the top. Funding biodiversity targets imply, as we have seen in the previous with the previous speakers, implies mobilizing billions of US dollars to fill the gap of biodiversity. But we also have to consider, and we believe that it is important to emphasize structural conditions that impede public investment, including many of the sectors most harmful to biodiversity, such as mining, extractive projects, oil and gas, agribusiness, aquaculture, etc., are actually linked to cycles of inequality, extraction, debt, and austerity, with economic benefits mostly flowing to the very wealthy. So, and this also has tremendous impact, differentiated impact on women. And we have to also consider, as Ching was commenting in her presentation, the need to include these transformative paths. Some of the challenges that we would like to highlight today regarding resource mobilization includes the legacies of colonialism. This is something that happens, that is there, and that we cannot avoid. Countries of the global south rely heavily on debt. Developing countries' debt is around 11 trillion US dollars. So we have to consider the historical extraction and appropriation from the global south and the underlying patterns of colonial appropriation that still remain. Also, historic gender inequalities with respect to access, participation, and decision-making of indigenous, rural, and diverse women are in multilateral spaces and instruments. It's also a challenge that needs to be overcome. Of course, we have tremendous gains, but it is still a challenge on the ground too. Access to information, procedural mechanisms, capacity building, and technological resources to effectively participate and decide on resource mobilization. Some challenge also barriers to access the funds. Sometimes funds don't reach communities. They are centralized, and this is why it is fundamental to find mechanisms that can actually support real solutions that recognize the historical responsibility. I would like to share a comment made by Camila Romero from our member group Colectivo Viento Sur from Chile. We discussed and exchanged some reflections on a podcast that is going to be launched coming soon, hosted by the Global Forest Coalition. And she said, what drives us is the defense of the territory. We need to learn more about these instruments precisely to strengthen our movements. There are many barriers, starting with access to information and technological resources. So if we see what she's actually, commenting on the limitations, it is already considered under Article 20 and in the convention. So we have to integrate mechanisms to actually include a gender lens to the periodical reviewing process of the strategy for resource mobilization, and divest funding from false solutions to support real solutions from women on the ground. Also, controversial climate funds is something that should be problematized as well. As you see in the screen, the Green Climate Fund was allocated $102 million to finance 6 projects. The one that I am highlighting here today corresponds to a GFC case study developed in Paraguay, which through the Arbaro Fund allocated $25 million for developing a project, agroforestal project of 75,000 hectares in Paraguay. And some of the gender differentiated impacts include of these monoculture tree plantations developed in Forestal Apepu and San Pedro plantations in Paraguay include, the fact that they are not a solution, an economic solutions. They are just temporarily poorly paid jobs. Forestry companies, according to the reports of the community, don't provide women with any opportunities, and the majority of the titles of the little work that is available are just for men. Also, the community displacement is another constant reality that we have to consider from traditional livelihoods. Also, land insecurity, especially for women, land when marketized, it shifts from women to men. So it is important to also understand what is beyond on the paper. Also difficulties for women in producing and selling their goods, which also affects the cultural and economic life of the communities. And the use, of course, of fertilizers and agrochemicals that pollute waters, biodiversity, and forests. It's just an example. So what happens when communities and women actually have the opportunity to have conservation spaces to make them work? What happens when we do have that possibility? Instead of speaking, I would like to play this video very shortly, so you can have an idea of what is going on in this community when they do have empowerment, access to protect, and to understand the correlation between the biodiversity ecosystems and the people who protects those reserves. So very quickly, this is a collective of campesino and community reserves of Santander in Colombia. It's a good example of climate resilience of frontline communities. Can you hear the video? Could you please confirm?
It is really low.
I can't hear anything.
Volume is still very low.
Yeah, it's really low, but for those speaking English, the interpreters will translate from Spanish to English. So if you would make use of if you would like to make use of the interpretation feature, because the video is in Spanish, so you would be able to hear from the interpreters.
Thank you, Amelia, for the clarification. Yes, unfortunately, it is not available in English. So
diversificado y todo se convierte en una reserva, los animales que usted tiene, domésticos, criollos, las plantas nativas, y nosotros también somos una reserva, la familia también es una reserva.
Con la semilla que usted come lo que siembra, abre camino y recoge de la tierra. Ese es el fruto que la vida te da. Esa raca chachacha fruto chontaduro y el maduro melao. Todo el mundo a sembrar para que pueda sanar. Que si compartes allá, te lo regalan acá. Yo no lo compro más, yo lo cultivo acá. Puro arroz natural, amaranto para amar, vino a lágrima de sol y la papita para la olla.
Pues el significado que tiene es poder tener un espacio de conservación, no solo de especies de flora y fauna como sería, sino también un espacio de conservación de la cultura propia y rescate de la cultura propia campesina.
Nosotros reservamos como a nuestra manera y lo que hemos aprendido en diversos talleres, pero con Claudia ya nos han enseñado un poquito como las reservas de otro modo. Entonces ahí no solo reservamos o sea, lo que es la naturaleza, sino se reservan tradiciones, cómo hacer un pan, se reservan expresiones, se reservan las ajoplas, se reserva bueno, ya lo que son las orquídeas. Sí, o sea, es una reserva donde podemos estar dentro de la reserva sin necesidad de una reserva tradicional que es la dejamos allá y no podemos tocar. Pues
So to conclude my presentation, I just wanted to highlight the importance of funneling resources to real solutions decided by the communities, including just transition, climate resilience of frontline communities, conservation, protection of land and forest and restoration, and of course, the need to phase out perverse incentive as it is established under targets 18 and 19. Thank you, and thank you all the participants for being here.
Thank you so much, Valentina, for this presentation. I think that actually, like the order of panelists has really worked very well because you have been able to build up in the other ones, and you have brought a really key point on that when speaking about mobilizing resources for biodiversity conservation, we are not just speaking about the Biodiversity Convention, but how it's actually related with the other conventions and also the resources that are flowing around them. And now, also linking to this main point that you're making about direct access to funds from the communities, we're going to listen now from Minnie Degawan, who will share with us about actually how can Indigenous peoples and local communities could directly access to resources, and how does that if there are any successful examples of how to integrate a human rights perspective into resource mobilization. Welcome, Minnie, and it is a pleasure to listen from you.
Thank you, Amelia, and thank you, Valentina and Ching. I cannot agree more to what has already been said, and I think what I will try to do is give some concrete experiences from the ground about this whole issue of gender and resource mobilization. First, I really like the fact that we need to first, even before talking about how do we bring resources to women and girls, to the youth, or to Indigenous peoples and local communities, I think before we even talk about bringing resources to them, let's talk about their contributions, because it's not as if Indigenous peoples, women and children or youth are only asking for resources. We have been doing this work for generations, and doing this simply because our survival as communities are tied to biodiversity conservation. And we've been doing it for generations despite the many threats that have been thrown our way, from colonization to the present day extractive industries coming into our territories. So despite the lack of resources being provided us by governments or any other funding agencies, we continue to do our part in conserving biodiversity. Unfortunately, when we do this to continue to defend and sustain biodiversity, we are criminalized. We are put into terror lists, and our lives are threatened. So aside from asking for resources so that we can continue to do what we have been doing, we again go back to the very, very basic starting point, that before we talk of resources, we acknowledge the contributions that we have made, what women continue to do. And I think it's important that we also really highlight the important role of women in biodiversity conservation. For instance, in this climate change actions, when they talk about the forest, they only look at the trees, and therefore in many Indigenous communities, the trees are the domain of men. And so it's the men who are being trained to do ranger roles. But if we look at the forest, it's more than the trees. And this is where the women come in. It's the small tasks, but are very, very important, because it's the women who do the seed selection, the seed collection, seed selection, and seed storage. And so they have a very important, but it's not very visible, because of course what you see are the big trees and not the seeds or the herbs that the women are actually making sure to continue to flourish. And in fact, biodiversity is assured when women do this cross-breeding of these different herbs. So I just wanted to highlight that, you know, the specific role that women play need to be highlighted. Second, let me reflect on what has worked in the past in terms of resource mobilization. Often those resources that are small grants, but are very, very targeted to community-based initiatives that are the results of women coming together, discussing the needs of their community, or even just the women. These are the ones that have been very successful. For instance, seed cooperatives where women get together, they talk about how do we make sure that the seeds that we are collecting gets to be shared. And these are also the types of projects that get funded. And these are small grants, and they are very, very successful in the sense that they are addressing very specific needs, and these needs were identified and are being implemented by women. And often these are the types of projects that do not have very long project proposal formats, that do not have log frames or spreadsheets. And these were successful. Of course, I think a great example of this would be the small grants program of the CHEF UNDP. And then on a medium scale, the medium scale funding would be those that have been successful are those that are still community based, that were really developed by the community and had the support of perhaps a national or a regional indigenous organization. And these are the types of projects that have been successful in the sense that women felt they own those projects. There are good results that they have shown. I have struggled very hard when I received the invitation from Amelia and the questions. I struggled very hard about what are the success stories about big funds. It's difficult because once they are big funds, then they have to follow a certain standard. They have to check these boxes. For many community-based women and indigenous peoples, these are something that we cannot identify with, that we cannot relate with. What are these check boxes? I understand that some of these are safeguards and wanting to safeguard the rights of women, of youth, but if the group that you are wanting to safeguard does not understand that instrument, then it is useless and it becomes something that becomes a burden for them as well as for the community. So it also changes the narrative when they are, whenever I hear this scaling up, I get goosebumps, because scaling up often means changing the narrative from the community base saying we need to safeguard our seeds. And usually those seeds are community-based seeds. But when you want to scale it up, you want to either go national or regional, and then you can go out of the traditional boundaries of the community and, of course, the women themselves. So you change the narrative, and by changing the narrative, the ownership is taken away from the women or from the community. So these are some of the difficulties that I've seen. So what are the lessons so far? Of course, again, I say, first and foremost, rights recognition. We cannot move forward without the formal recognition of the rights of indigenous peoples, the communities, and of women. And then we have to start from the actual needs of the community. We cannot be coming up with concept notes that are developed in Washington, D.C. or in Songdo, and then going and saying, we have a concept note. Who wants to partner with us? Who wants to do this project? And more and more, I see this happening with these big funds coming in, is that you have intermediary organizations, what do we call them? Implementing agencies or executing agencies, developing projects, and then going to communities and selling this project to them, rather than the other way around. What has worked really is if we start from the ground up, and this is where I think we have to also understand that our communities, indigenous communities and women are used to working at that level. So if once you go to a national level, then yes, you will need to have an intermediary organization. And there are already national and regional organizations of women, of Indigenous people. So let's work with them rather than trying to create a false global coalition of partners who will then do the implementation. When there are already existing Indigenous organizations or women's organizations, why don't we work with them instead of creating new entities that actually also then take away much needed resources for these existing organizations and formations? So of course, there is a role for NGOs, but the NGOs have to prove that they are sincere, that they fully understand the dynamics of the communities, and that their agenda is first and foremost the agenda of the communities. The goals of the community should always be the primary goal. When we talk of biodiversity conservation, it's not simply conserving this specific species, but we have to look at it from a holistic perspective. And I'm happy to note that more and more there's this broadening of the minds and seeing it in a more holistic perspective rather than just saying, oh, we need to conserve this species, we need to conserve the forest. And when we talk about the forest, we talk of the trees and we talk of the carbon. When for many communities, carbon is at the top of their priority. Their priority is the food security of their community. So the first thing that they want to ensure is the sustainability of their food crops. So I think that's where one of the things that is important. So when we talk about this resource mobilization, we have to bear in mind that for many communities, women, youth, they all look at these things in a different way, and we have a different way of narrating our needs and as well as the stories of how we did this. We cannot be constrained by your Excel spreadsheets or your log frames. And I hope that even in the resource mobilization world, that there is this understanding that there are different ways of doing things, and we should not be constrained by what has worked before, and what has worked before can be changed. Because we're talking about gender, I also wanted to highlight that often we talk of poverty alleviation, income generation, and often women take the brunt of increasing household incomes. And often we are happy to report to funders that we have increased the household income of this community, but we do not look at the other unintended consequences of increasing the income of one household. We always want to look at the positive side and say, oh, we have increased the income by $10 per month, without diving deeper into what are the consequences of that $10 increase. It can be increased violence within the house because there's an extra income, so the husband can have money to buy alcohol and drink, and once they're drunk, then there's violence. Or it can also lead to even threats to biodiversity. And I've seen this in many communities. When there is extra income, then there's no more urgent need to do the gardening outside the home, and therefore the usual plants that we plant around the home are already lost, because now we can go and buy it. It's even in the rice variety that we have now, is because there is so much, there's the cash economy. People would rather go and buy the jasmine rice from Thailand rather than continuing to cultivate the traditional rice variety. So before we talk about all of this, and we should look at poverty alleviation, biodiversity conservation, climate change as a whole rather than separate, and then making sure that we look at the different consequences of the actions that we are doing. So again, I will close by saying that when we talk of resource mobilization, first and foremost, we should not look at communities and women as beggars or just a group of people just asking funding or resources going to their projects, but we should look at them as those groups who have actually done so much for biodiversity conservation, and that their actions are effective and therefore should be supported. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Minnie. And you know, like being a moderator is not an easy task because I would like to engage in a conversation with all of you, but I can't. So I'm just gonna pick a couple of the points that you have mentioned, aiming to allocate a bit more of time to the Q&A and conversation with so many participants that we have today. And one of these points that you have made is that resource mobilization is not only about financial flows, but actually about rights recognition. And while recognizing that women, IPLCs, and youth are rights holders, that actually change the way we are looking into how do we mobilize those resources and how do we create mechanisms or we ease them, for these groups to access the funding. And in just bringing up that one point, because you have made many really important contributions with this about how the institutions are reconsidering their role towards or how to engage with communities and rights holders. I would like to go into our next panelist, which is Verona Collantes from the Jeff Gender Partnership, that will discuss with us about policy recommendations that governments and institutions could follow to ensure that resource mobilization efforts prioritize gender responsive outcomes and that they are aware about these unintended outcomes that you were mentioning to Minnie. So without anything to add, I would like to give the mic to you, Verona. Welcome to this roundtable and thanks for being here.
Thank you, Amelia. Is my sound clear?
Yes, it
okay,
is.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here with so many of you gender advocates and women's rights advocates and defenders. I'm humbled, and I mean, I think Amelia, you put me in a very difficult spot being the last speaker, because the other speakers, I actually have a presentation, but I don't think I'm gonna put them up, because I would rather pick up from the very rich conversation that has already started, and I'm basically just soaking them in. I'm taking notes, and I know that there are a number of things that we as the Global Environment Facility can respond to and have to address. There are so many points with limited time, and I want to also afford opportunity for discussion, as Amelia mentioned. So let me just maybe give some more of a headline kind of messages with the limited time. At the Global Environment Facility, with the conversation that we've had, I wanted to spin it in a more positive way, but also maybe with a view of listening to you later on how we can do things better. As you may know, and you're familiar with the big institutions, which include us, we're governed by policies and some programming directions. And I want to start with that because I think these are instruments. I know they are something written up and some actions have to be done, but they define how we do things. So speaking of policies, we have a gender equality policy, and we also have programming directions. And that's the same for the Global Biodiversity Framework and the Global Biodiversity Framework Fund. So I want to put those things together because this is kind of defining what the national governments can do, what multi-stakeholders can do. And I've spoken to some of you, and I think we can look at how we can make it work, given that I know we've heard Minnie spoke about, you know, having all these templates, and sometimes it doesn't work, but we learn along the way. So we have this gender policy, as I mentioned, and in the project design, there are the implementing agencies that you've mentioned cannot get approval of a project unless they satisfy our gender requirements, which includes aspects like how have you engaged women in the communities, and gender experts and gender advisors. How are you engaging stakeholders, including IPLCs, young people? There's an aspect of participation in that. There's an aspect of in the project, are we addressing access to resources? Are we thinking about benefits? Are we thinking about gender-based violence? So there are a number of issues that we want projects to reflect in the design of the project itself. So not as a separate component that you have, that you show that you have done your gender analysis, but really linking it to a project. If it's an ecosystems restoration project, if it's a land degradation neutrality related project. So we try to do that. And I think I've been with the Jeff for just a little over a year, but I've seen how the projects that I'm reviewing has evolved from a gender perspective. And I'm looking at something really positive, and I want to see how we could all work together so that when it comes to the implementation, that these are really done the way that they are designed. The other aspect, again, mindful of the time limitations, the other aspect that I want to mention is the reference to direct financing. I know some of you know about the small grants program of the Jeff, and Minnie has mentioned that, and some others. That's one mechanism, but one more recent, yes, the SGP, we're continuing that. We're adding more funding to that. We're adding more agencies aside from UNDP, again, kind of like diversifying the players on the ground. So we are adding some 2 other or more Jeff agencies to implement the small grants program. So that's something, an innovation that we're doing. And then there is the Inclusive Conservation Initiative. Some of you may have heard of it. Some of you I see here, some of your organizations are actually involved in that as the executing partners. So this Inclusive Conservation Initiative is a pilot, in fact, introduced in 2019, and it's now it's starting to be implemented. And it's for direct financing destined for Indigenous and local communities, Indigenous peoples. So I know that some of you are involved in this. I see some of the organizations, Indigenous peoples organizations, that are actually part of that. And the idea for this is just exactly as you mentioned, like we give the resources directly to the Indigenous peoples and local communities who are leading environmental projects and development initiatives, cultural and development initiatives in the communities. And we have at the moment, we have Argentina, Chile, Cook Islands, Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Fiji, Guatemala, and a few others as pilot countries, but we are thinking of expanding this. So again, thinking of showing that the GEF is listening to our stakeholders, and we have the Indigenous People's Advisory Group, for example. So it's just speeding it up for the Global Biodiversity Framework Fund. And again, you know that this has, those who attended the GEF Assembly, this has been adopted. So now it's the GEF that will be the Secretariat for this fund. And you've heard it from Markus, the programming directions that was adopted, again, enforces that the aspect of inclusivity and gender responsiveness. And also you've heard that 20% of the financial resources that are going to be mobilized under the GBFF will be allocated to Indigenous peoples. And that's in the programming directions. So we have, and one more, maybe just to wrap up on the GBFF, the GBFF will have a council. And again, this is something new and something that points to the GEF really focusing on broader social inclusion, because now in the GBFF council, we will open up for more observers, including for women's groups. So again, this is an opportunity to bring in this more stakeholders, including women. We already have IP Indigenous peoples there. We already have CSOs. We'll also be including it to young people. Finally, the aspect of your question about, so how do we translate this on the ground, right? So how can the national governments embrace all of these programming directions? I think just a quick point about how normally Minnie mentioned about how the project concepts are developed. And for the GEF, we encourage really this bottom-up approach, but of course it's not perfect. There is a mechanism at the national level to have steering committees, and this is what we encourage. I mean, I had the privilege to attend one of these what we call national dialogues in the Philippines, and I saw how a steering committee and like multi-stakeholder process works, and I think that's really what I would expect governments to do, and what GEF is trying to push governments to do, to consult with all the stakeholders, including local communities, grassroots. And I've seen some of them in that meeting, and they were really like talking to their government counterparts. So I think that's something that I would I see as a way forward. And I take your point again, mentioning that it has to be really bottom up, and we're trying to work more with our agencies so that this comes back to them also as a lesson and a good practice. I'll stop there, and I'll be happy to elaborate on some of the points I mentioned in the Q&A. And thank you again, Amelia and colleagues.
Thank you so much, Verona, for sharing this perspective from the institutional side. And yeah, it was a bit, it was intentional to leave you at this position exactly because of this bottom up, and because knowing you and the work that you are doing at the GEF, I think it's a really good example of how institutions actually can be transformed, following what women on the ground are asking for. No? And but having said that, I will actually first of all, thank all this fantastic panel for understanding which coordinated efforts should be put in place to guarantee women and girls that their rights are recognized in biodiversity resource mobilization. And we have a couple of questions. So I'm gonna read the three of them, and I'm gonna ask any from the panel that would like to address them. And then we will have one comment, a live comment from Edith Bastidas. And after those three questions and the comment, we can have, if you want, a final round of like a final message round. So the first question that we have here is coming from Joyce. She says, let me find her again. How do communities, especially women and youth or developing countries, give feedback on institutions that provide financial resources for biodiversity conservation or climate change that later result to negative impacts, referred to as pervasive incentives? So perhaps, Valentina, you could share the experience from the Global Climate Fund, and perhaps Verona on how the GEF could receive this kind of grievance, if it has a grievance mechanism, no? And or the other panelists, of course, if you have the experience on this. Then the second question, it's for you, Verona. It's a more specific one on which are the new implementing agencies for the GEF. And then we have another one coming from Alejandra. She's asking what effective practices have been implemented in projects to ensure equality and active participation of women at all stages of projects. So perhaps this Ching and Minnie, you could take this if you wish to do so. And also Markus, if my colleague Sumina, if you can also spot him, so we have him in the panel. And yeah, over to you, however you want to answer.
Yes,
please.
I could comment on the question, on Joyce's question. Thank you, Joyce, for interacting with us, and also to see this space as a dialogue space that we can exchange information. We are not the owners of the knowledge here, but we are just sharing some insights that we have had from research, or from the expertise that we have had within our organizations. So basically, I think the communities, and especially women and youth in developing countries, have a few mechanisms to give feedback on the impacts of what is happening. And this is a very interesting question in terms of assessing how can we actually develop mechanisms bottom up, as my colleague Verona was commenting, to actually include the voices of the communities so they can, speak out about the impacts of those perverse incentives, right? So for example, the Green Climate Fund, the GCF, has historically funded highly controversial projects, such as, I don't know, a 25 million equity agreement with the Arbaro Fund, as I commented in my presentation, which is a Germany-based private equity investment that has developed projects in the Global South, including the example of Paraguay that I shared with you, which has gender differentiated impacts and has led to devastating not only the social, the environment, but also the subjectivity and the community development of the women and girls who are working there. So it is fundamental that we assess this as a common but differentiated responsibility, and that we problematize on how could mechanisms be developed in order to assess the impacts. How do communities do it? Sometimes through stakeholders and civil society organizations who are on the ground, working and following all the impacts, the gender differentiated impacts on the ground. Sometimes it would be interesting to have access to the communities, to go there, to see what is going on, to listen to the voices, and develop gender tools that can actually help us to assess what is going on in the spectrum of women and girls. So I don't know if I provided some comments, but I just would like to share also and see what all my other colleagues can comment.
Amelia, I can mention the Jeff grievance process. So obviously it's something that we take seriously, and I mean in the short time that I have been with the Jeff, I have been contacted about this. But in terms of the formal mechanism under the Jeff governance structure, the Jeff agencies, the implementing agencies, are actually required to put in place or to have in place a grievance and accountability system, and that's part of the project design. That has to be funded, and that it's clarified. It's clear there that they're putting in place that mechanism. And the idea is for all complaints, both in terms of project preparation and implementation, that this mechanism will be able to respond to those complaints. In addition, the Jeff Secretariat itself also has established a position, a Jeff Conflict Resolution Commissioner in the Jeff Secretariat, and if the Jeff agencies are not the safe space to submit comments, then you can those who have complaints can also then submit it directly to the Jeff Secretariat Conflict Resolution Commissioner.
Yes, Minnie.
Perhaps
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Perhaps I could quickly complement from the perspective of the global process. I mentioned the further work on the strategy for resource mobilization, and associated with that, there has actually been an open call to share information and experiences and lessons learned. So that would be, I guess, along the thrust of that question. So we send a notification to that effect, and that includes stakeholder organization, women organizations, IPLC organizations, etc. So I mean, by all means, see that you can basically further disseminate that open call and collect any information that you deem useful, and then bring it back to the global level so that we can share that with the advisory committee as an input into their work.
I wanted to respond to that question and then segue into the question of ensuring women participation. On the issue of the grievance mechanisms, great to know that there are these. The problem is, one, communities do not know about this. Two, they are not accessible. Three, they're not culturally appropriate. Some of them, you're required to write it, or if you're not required to write it, to use a phone and call a number. So language, connectivity issues, and all of that. I'm not trying to be negative here, but these are actual experiences of communities and of women accessing both the GCF and the Jeff. And I've had a long experience with the Jeff. I was a manager of a global project and then part of the implementing agency for the Inclusive Conservation Initiative. So I know what it goes in there. So going into how do we ensure the effective participation of women and communities, first and foremost, we have to get out of this mindset that we are bringing projects to benefit them and that they will become beneficiaries of these projects. Rather, we should look at these projects as a partnership. And therefore, if you're building a partnership, first and foremost, you have to build trust. So there has to be trust building between the funder, the implementing agencies, the community, and the women. So how do you build trust? First, you have to really inform them what this project is, what are the processes where they can intervene, how can they submit a complaint, how can they submit how can they participate? It's nice and good to have a checklist that says, have you consulted women? Have you consulted communities? But if the communities or the women do not know how to participate, much less that they are able to participate, then it's pointless. So it's great that there are policies in place, there are safeguards in place, but if the communities and the groups that are meant to benefit from these policies do not know about this, do not know how to engage with the GEF or the GCF or with the grievance mechanisms, then they are pointless. Then they just become pieces of paper that gets checked. So I think it's very, very important that we have to flip the narrative that they are not beneficiaries, they are partners. And if they are partners, there has to be constant dialogue. I know it will take years, but the GEF already takes 24 months to approve a proposal. So why can't we take the time to have meaningful conversations, and also using a set of indicators for each and every, one common set of indicators for all the projects, I think is a great disservice, because we're not recognizing the diversity that happens at the community level. So you ask, how many women participated? And so what happens is it becomes a mere counting exercise. The question is not really how many women participated, but the question should be, how are the ideas of women incorporated in the project? Because it can be just one woman in there, but all this inputs from other women's groups are included. You can have 100 women participating in a workshop, but the inputs are not integrated in the final proposal, then that's pointless. So we also have to study those checklists, those indicators, those, I don't know what you call them, the things that you often look. I just got reminded of one project that we did, which was to interview different community organizations with a project that was done. And they were all saying, oh, the women are very happy with this project because this project came in and it required the women to be part of the seminar. So women were no longer cooking. And so they were outside, they were inside the conference room listening. But so they were saying that it was successful in the sense that women were excused from the role of cooking their food, but then it added costs to the seminar because then they have to cater. But these are just examples of the some of the indicators or some of the things that funders check become pointless when they do not take into consideration the cultural dynamics, the context that exists in the different communities. So I again go back to my my usual call: dialogue, dialogue, dialogue. Respect that the communities, the women have something to share, and it shouldn't always be coming from the outside. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Minnie, for sharing and addressing these questions. Let us hear now from you, Ching, and if you could also, while answering about the participation, effective participation of women at all stages, if you could address Simon's question, so we can also move forward in the questions list.
Okay, thank you so much, and thank you to Minnie also for raising those very important points. I agree fully with her, and I don't think I can add much more to that. I just wanted to just have a reflection about the issue of scale, which you also mentioned in the comments. I think, and I draw a lot from, because I also am quite active in the agroecology conversation, and I think we've, a lot of to do with scale doesn't, I think we have to relook at what we think about scale, because we can think about, for example, scaling out, multiplying many successful small initiatives, for example. We can think about scaling up, not necessarily in terms of scaling up like huge resources to one community in that sense, which may, change the narrative, as Minnie has said, but more in terms of how we get governments to actually start putting in the enabling conditions that actually can help women and girls and Indigenous peoples and local communities to continue what they're doing. And then thirdly, and I think this is also important, the concept of scaling deep, where we are actually talking about changing mindsets, changing narratives, and to really have effective change. And this has to start, as has been mentioned already, with the recognition of the rights, right? And we have the hooks in the GBF, for example, because it claims to be we have those hooks on gender justice and a rights-based approach within the GBF. And this actually has to actually permeate into policy and implementation. Just to go to Simone's question, I fully agree with what she has said in the chat regarding the need to really talk about the transformation of the overall global financial architecture, because the problem is not having resources, or this so-called finance gap that governments are trying to meet of 700 to 900 billion US dollars is one aspect, and is only a small tip of the iceberg, as Valentina showed in her presentation, because on the other flip side, you have the perverse incentives. We talked a little bit about that, but underneath the water, you have a bigger, the hidden costs of what the global economic structure puts in place. So for example, I talked a little bit about debt and tax justice, but also that we know that actually governments are often pushed into certain pathways, which are usually export-oriented, because of IMF, World Bank conditionalities, structural adjustment programs, trade and investment, free trade agreements, conditions, right? And then they double down on these activities, which are often linked to mining, industrial agriculture, fossil fuels, also to earn foreign currency to repay their debts, right, to service their debts. So, I mean, if we don't address these parts, as Simone has said, of the global financial architecture, then this obviously remains a big issue. I will share in the chat, we just published a book today written by a colleague of mine, which is called really A Feminist Social Contract Rooted in Fiscal Justice, an outline of 8 feminist economic alternatives for intersectional justice. So I'm going to post the information about that book. It's available freely for download on our website. So hopefully that helps in the conversation as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ching. And yes, please share that link. Now let us hear from Edith, one of our participants that would like also to share one of her thoughts regarding resource mobilization.
Muchas gracias por este importante evento. Creo que hay efectivamente grandes retos, como lo han dicho nuestras panelistas, con la participación de las mujeres, especialmente en el tema de financiación. Pero por supuesto que tenemos que seguir trabajando en este gran reto. Yo he evaluado algunos proyectos en donde se pide el enfoque de género y se nota que de pronto lo copiaron de algún lado y no ha sido trabajado con las mujeres este tema para presentar los proyectos. Sin embargo, todos los organismos internacionales, las organizaciones, todos tenemos un gran papel, pero yo creo que los financiadores definitivamente pueden ayudar muchísimo en ensanchar la participación de la mujer. Y voy a mencionar aquí unos puntos que muchos de estos pues ya los han dicho, casi que resumo lo que han dicho muchas de ustedes, pero que hemos analizado desde la Red de Mujeres Indígenas. Pues es importante que haya en primer lugar una participación paritaria, una asistencia paritaria a todos estos eventos donde se discutan los temas financieros, porque efectivamente pues se da mucha mayor participación o se facilita la participación de nuestros hermanos varones, pero las mujeres generalmente no estamos allí. Por otro lado, claro, en los proyectos muy importante que siga siendo una exigencia y que haya unos indicadores claros para evaluar el enfoque de género en estos proyectos. Asimismo, ya lo han dicho, creo que hay buenísimas experiencias con el programa de pequeñas donaciones, tanto a nivel internacional como específicamente acá en el caso de Colombia, en donde se ha direccionado a iniciativas de mujeres y esto ha dado grandes logros. O sea, hemos tenido resultados muy importantes apoyando esas iniciativas de las mujeres directamente. Por otro lado, pues creo que siempre es necesario fortalecer esas capacidades de las mujeres. Creo que hay que seguir fortaleciendo capacidades, tener unos programas pertinentes para ese fortalecimiento de las capacidades personales, pero también se requiere un fortalecimiento institucional, porque como digo, con los anteriores proyectos muchas iniciativas ya arrancaron, se establecieron, pero ahora necesitan crecer. Pero las organizaciones a veces no tienen la personería, no tienen una oficina, no tienen medios de comunicación, entonces qué importante poder apoyar todo para que estas iniciativas de conservación de las mujeres sigan creciendo. Y por otro lado, pues que se necesita que todos estos temas se aborden con una pertinencia, no solamente de género, sino también con pertinencia cultural para que nuestras mujeres indígenas y todas las mujeres en general, pues de comunidades locales y en general todas las mujeres podamos seguir participando. Sería eso, muchas gracias.
Thank you so much, Edith. And I think that if we had planned this, it wouldn't be as good as it was. Like, thank you so much for providing the closing remarks, actually, for this panel. And if you allow me, I will just share a couple of ideas extra, or just to reiterate them, because actually has been shared by our panelists. And is that as we are moving into the closing part of this event, as Women Caucus, we really consider the importance of making all resource mobilizations efforts gender transformative. That means that we need to address proactively the deep-seated gender inequalities that have resulted from unequal access to and benefits from financial resources. But also, as being shared, by taking a historical perspective, we recognize the need for decolonial perspectives in our resource mobilization strategies. It is imperative that we address and redress historical injustices. And finally, and we would like to leave this message here, and has been shared here and was shared at the Jeff Assembly in many other spaces, there is an urgency to share the narrative that we as women, we are not beneficiaries, we are not credit seekers, loan seekers, or charity beggars. We are equal partners in the quest for equitable and inclusive biodiversity finance, partners whose rights and contributions should be recognized and guaranteed. And having said that, I would like to thank our panel for being here today. We always try to bring different perspectives to analyze these topics with different lens and experiences. And I think that the participants are grateful for that. And also thank you so much for all the people that participated today, for your questions. Your comments are really, really, really appreciated. You also bring a lot of richness to the discussions. And well, having said that, we will share when is the next event for this year. It's going to be the last of this series, but hopefully we will share many good news after the intersessional meetings of the CBD. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here, and have a nice rest of the day.